It's a great pleasure and honor to host this event this morning, this Friday morning. Why is this panel so important right now? Let me give you some points, and I hope that our panelists will elaborate even further to prove my point that this panel is important. It helps us understand not only what's happening in the Middle East, but why things are happening the way they are. It reveals some of the strongest forces behind the changes that people are crying out for. It asks the question of whether there is hope for positive change through the outlets of religion, social movements, and protest. The Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies is honored to host such an event together with its sister chair, the TUI Chair of Interreligious Studies at John Carroll University, and together also with Case Western Reserve University, especially Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies, with funding from the Social Science Research Council, the Baker North Center for Humanities at Case Western Reserve University. So all of these institutions that I mentioned are sponsoring this event. And we will have this afternoon another panel at Case. I am very sure that you will enjoy our panelists today. All of them are great scholars in their fields. I will not introduce them now because I know our moderator, Chris Tensing, will introduce each of them in more detail. Here also I like to make some announcements that we will have in the future. This spring, we are planning to host two great events. One international event, international conference on the respect for the sacred and freedom of expression. Are these two can these two coexist, or are they opposing each other? And I hope that I will get some feedbacks maybe after the lecture from my colleagues about this as well, because this is just in the first stage. We are thinking to invite prominent scholars to John Carroll on this topic from different communities, in fact, from different traditions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and maybe even from Buddhist and Hindu tradition. The second event that we will have will be on March 2022, actually. We call it the Annual Week of Islamic Art and Culture. This will be the 6th Annual Week of Islamic Art and Culture. And our current plan is to invite a professor from University of California in Los Angeles, a professor of Judaic studies, but also an expert of Islamic studies, Professor Firestone. You might have heard of him. We have sent invitation, but we need a confirmation from him, and hope we will do this with Case Western Reserve University, again, Center for Judaic Studies. So with this announcement, I'd like to just thank you again for coming and for joining us this morning. I know that some students will be coming maybe around probably 10 because they had classes and they couldn't cancel their classes. So if you see some doors are opening, don't become frustrated. I like to turn over the floor to our panelists, in fact. Thank you very much. Chris, would you like to come here, or would you like to do that?
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? In the back? All right. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking John Carroll University and also Pete Moore at Case Western for the very kind invitation to all of us to come to Cleveland and address all of you. This is a very important part of what we do at the Middle East Research and Information Project, which is public outreach to people across the country about the contemporary affairs of the Middle East. My name is Chris Tenzing. I am the editor of our publication, Middle East Report, and by default, I'm the executive director of the parent nonprofit, the Middle East Research and Information Project, or MERIP. I'm going to moderate today's discussion, and mostly I will stay out of the way, but by way of introduction, I just want to say a couple of words about MERIP and what it is. MERIP, as I said, is a nonprofit. It's a public education organization that is based in Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1971, and its purpose is exactly what the title makes it sound like, to produce high-quality research and information about contemporary Middle East affairs and disseminate it to the American and international public. We have two main activities, one of which is our own publications. The flagship one there is our print magazine called Middle East Report, which is quarterly. I brought some sample copies that you're free to take at the end of today's event. We also publish a web-only version of the magazine, which we call Middle East Report Online, on our website, which is merip.org. And our second activity is this kind of thing, public outreach via the media and via events like this one. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speakers. And all of our speakers today are members of our editorial committee, the people who help to conceptualize, plan, and execute the issues of Middle East Report. And I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will appear. It's slightly different than the order that appears, I think, on the flyer. The first speaker will be Professor Asif Bayat from the University of Illinois in the Department of Sociology, and he's going to give us a sort of broad overview of the very exciting social movements and protest movements that have blossomed in the Middle East in the last couple of years. We will then move to Professor Norma Maruzzi from the University of Illinois Chicago, who will focus on the question of women and gender and the participation of women in social movements. And then we will have a substitution in the program, Professor Josh Stacker from Kent State, who is a specialist on Egypt, and we'll talk about what has been the tumult in Egypt in the last couple of years. And finally, Professor Khaled Medani from McGill University in Montreal, who will talk about Sudan and the Horn of Africa and the very undercovered and understudied social movements that have blossomed in Sudan in the period of the Arab revolts in the last couple of years. I want to say just briefly, the person on the flyer, Jeannie Sowers, who was scheduled to be with us, was unable to join us at the last minute because of a family health emergency. And I also want to invite everybody to, if you can, make it across town to Case Western. Later this afternoon, there will be another panel of MERIP editors focusing on the question of art and culture and the relation of those domains to the uprisings of the last couple of years. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Bayat.
Thank you very much, Chris. And also I'd like to thank our colleagues at this university who have arranged to accommodate us, the panel here. I really appreciate that. And it's wonderful to be with you today. I will be speaking largely about religious movements, especially Islamic movement and the revolution. And in post-revolution, I will be trying to be brief. You know, during the revolution, there was somewhat a panic on the part of certain segments of the population, for instance, in the United States, largely from conservative side, as well as certain governments, like the government of Israel on the one hand, and the government of Iran on the other hand, as well as, of course, the incumbent governments whose regimes were under, the attack of the revolutionaries, that these revolutions are going to herald the coming of yet another wave of Islamist revivalism, and in fact, these revolutions are Islamist religious revolutions. I think this, this kind of attitude has been somewhat reinforced in recent years, recent months, especially by the ascendancy of certain religious parties in the countries like in Egypt or in Tunisia, and especially in the recent days with what is happening with respect to this anti-Islam video and the reactions to it. So are we really on the verge of another kind of wave of Islamic revolutions in the Middle East? I think my argument has been in the past that not really. Although Islam religion plays a very significant part in these sort of post-revolutionary politics, as such, these are not Islamist. And I think the reason why there is this panic derives from three things. One is that there is a semantic confusion as to what is Islamic or Islamist. And I think also conceptual, as well as I think also there is a persistence of this old-fashioned sort of exceptionalism. And I'll come back to this a bit later. But let me say what I mean by Islamism. I mean, my argument has been that largely what is happening is what I've called sort of a post-Islamist trend in the Middle Eastern societies. But to understand what is post-Islamism, let's say what Islamism is. By Islamism, I understand those ideologies and movements that want to establish some kind of an Islamic order, a religious state, Sharia law, and in moral codes in Muslim societies. For Islamists, association with the state is very important. They want to take over the state, not because taking over the state would ensure their rule, but also it is a venue for them to enforce the religious dictum, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, or the dictum command good and forbid wrong. This means that the Islamist normative and legal perspective places more emphasis on people's obligations rather than their rights. And so therefore people are perceived more as subjects, dutiful subjects, rather than as rightful citizens. So the examples are the Iran's hardliners these days, or Pakistani Jamaat Islami, or Indonesian Lashkar Jihad, or Somali's Shabab al-Islami. Now, post-Islamism is different. It is not un-Islamic or anti-Islamic or even secular, yet it recognizes, it kind of unleashes or represents a critique of Islamism from within and from without. It wants to transcend Islamism by emphasizing rights rather than just obligations. And it stresses on citizenship. It wants to mix religiosity and rights, faith and freedom, and Islam and democracy. It wishes to establish largely a secular, more or less democratic or civil state, but it wants to promote, however, a religious society. It's very important. They want to have a religious society. The examples are, I think, Iran's Green Movement, right, today, or PKS in Indonesia, or more or less, at least segments of AKP in Turkey. Now, I think that the Arab Revolution that we have seen largely sort of espouses this kind of ideas, mostly post-Islamist ideas. And I think this is very different. This is very different from the Arab politics of, say, late 1980s or 1990s, when Islamism was really in its heydays. So there has been a dramatic, I think, transformation and change, and why this change has taken place, and in what way this kind of ideas by who was espoused is a long story. I can't get into detail, but in the question time, maybe I will be able to explain. What I can say, however, that by the sort of late the year 2000, I would argue that a new public really has emerged in the Arab world that has ideologically espoused more post-national, post-ideological, and especially post-Islamist ideas. Post-national basically means that their focus has been on largely on internal issues such as democracy and human rights, and rather than external issues. Or they have been even somewhat post-ideological in the sense that there have been an overriding of ideological between secular, religious, or different ideological divides, especially during the revolution and post-Islamist, in the sense that political Islam has not been really on the agenda for them, but the focus has been on civil democratic state rather than Islamic one. Now, I think one significant reason for this, especially post-Islamism, has been the fact that Islamist politics, in the 1990s has gone into, in my view, a good degree of crisis. If you look at Iran, by and large, which represents, Islamism par excellence, hasn't really worked. It's constantly in the crisis. I think 9/11 and the politics afterwards has undermined the appeal of Islamism among, many ordinary Muslims. I think by and large it hasn't really delivered, and many Muslims feel that they have been demoralized by it. It's violated a lot of human rights, and Al-Qaeda violence we know has victimized many ordinary people, especially ordinary Muslims, who they feel that have been victimized by it. So for many Muslim believers, Islamism really instrumentalized Islam as religion and kind of politicized it, and a lot of them necessarily don't like it. So in a sense, they prefer to keep Islam but break away from Islamism. So that's kind of in some way the story during the revolution. So the idea basically has been to create the democratic, accountable state that also pays attention to, social justice and people's dignity. And we see that during the revolution, religious slogans and concern with religion, Islam, was minimal or absolutely, in fact, absent in almost all of these remarkable uprisings. Now, what about now? Haven't these revolutions now, what we are seeing with the ascendancy of religious parties, Islamic parties in those countries, doesn't mean that we are now, this revolution actually has led to the Islamic takeover of the regime of the states? I would say not really exactly. First of all, if you look at places like Libya or Algeria, religious parties have lost. It is largely the secular liberal parties who have won the elections. And secondly, if you look at places like in Morocco, that Nahda party is in power, or in Tunisia where the PJD is in power, I would say that these movements are not Islamist, strictly speaking, in the way that I described to you. They are, by and large, post-Islamist. And Nahda in Tunisia and PJD in Morocco are, by and large, committed to electoral democracy. They wish to follow similar line as, for instance, their Turkish AKP counterpart. They are interested not in a religious state, but in civil and secular state. But they also, as I said, want religion to be present in public sphere. So I can, go into detail to describe how this happened, but again, there isn't much time. But in Egypt, however, things are more complicated. I think Joshua is going to talk about it, but what I can say is that I think I have observed in the last perhaps a few years, some kind of a split is taking place in Muslim Brothers. The old guard still seems to utter the language of Islamism, but nevertheless, their party, at least officially, they seem to want a civil state. Their youth, by and large, moving towards what I have described as post-Islamism, and a lot of them are very critical of their leadership. Certainly, the rise of Salafism, I think, is a real surprise for a lot of observers. But believe it or not, Salafism is also somewhat is divided. There are a variety of them. There are jihadi, there are quietists, there are apolitical. And in the case of Egypt, for instance, the Nur Party, if you look at their program, even they believe in, even they say that they want civil state. But anyway, for their action, we've got to wait and see how things really develop, especially by looking at the constitutions that will emerge soon in these post-revolutionary countries. But something which is also interesting and important is happening is that there is a societal also change. A number of value survey conducted in countries like in Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia in post-revolution basically attests to the fact that largely people are concerned not necessarily with the establishment of some kind of a religious state, but rather they believe that revolutions largely was for instance, in Egypt, 60% of the said it was for democracy and economic prosperity, and 25% said that it was for economic equality, so on. However, the parties, Islamic parties, I'm not saying Islamist parties, I'm saying Islamic parties or religious parties, places in Tunisia or Morocco, and even Muslim Brothers in Egypt are all are likely to be committed to electoral democracy, meaning that they would organize to come to power, like in Indonesia, their religious party, they would compete for power, and I would expect that they would also leave power, and that's very important. So they come to power, they leave, and basically it is very likely that they would play the games of democratic rules. But I think the challenge for this post-Islamist parties or politics is how much this post-Islamist religious or moral ethics would conflict with the liberal values of individual rights and liberties. So issues of lifestyle, religious freedom, non-religious ethics, and issues like this. I think that the likely clash between post-Islamist ethics and liberal values might, of course, depending on the extent of the clash, settle in some kind of illiberal democracy, where electoral democracy may go along with some, I think, variable, probably curb on liberties. Of course, we've had this, story in the Western countries as well, in the Western democracies as well, and they have also experienced electoral democracies with a lot of debate and discussion, as well as restriction on certain civil liberties, issues of gay marriage or gender equality and civil rights and so on and so forth, but even this continues until today. However, if electoral democracy, if it persists, I think it can open the space for debate over and possibly extend the scope of these very liberties. So it seems to me that I'm pretty optimistic. Thank you.
Should work, I think.
Hello, good morning. And thanks to everybody who is here early on a beautiful Friday morning, so inside and with us as opposed to outside, and particularly to thank the organizers of today's events here at John Carroll, because it's really a pleasure for us to be able to come and speak with you, have some discussion about these issues. I am doing that awful thing, which is showing PowerPoint, but they're actually because I want to make reference to some of these tables, some statistics in my talk, and actually it is easier to see them rather than for me to try to rattle them off. But I apologize in advance. I hope I won't fiddle with this too much, so because I know that's always the academics trying to manage technology doesn't always work that well. So what I'm here to speak with you about today is to focus particularly on Iran and on the situation of society in Iran. Now, for many of us who are studying the Middle East and in general commentators, the news, ordinary people around the world, the events of what's now referred to as the Arab Spring, Spring 2011, everybody says they were a total surprise. They were so unexpected. And in fact, there have been academic publications entitled, "How Did We Miss It?" Things like this. I mean, no one saw this coming. And of course, history can't be predicted, but it really was a little even more unexpected than usual. And that was true with the Arab Spring, but it was also true 2 years before with what the emergence of the Green Movement in Iran. And for those of us following events in Iran, there were understandings about the dynamism of society, the antipathy of much of society for the politics of the dominant faction in the government, but still a number of us had sort of complained, oh, these young people in Iran, they're so apathetic, they're just interested in themselves. So the mass mobilization and particularly the youth protest on the streets in Iran in spring 2009, summer 2009, after the June 2009 presidential election, also caught us by surprise. Now, without being too fervent as an Iran scholar, there is a way in which, following what Professor Bayat was saying, that Iran has in some ways been a forerunner of many in the last 30 years, of many events in the Middle East. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, the coming to power of an Islamist movement, and in fact that reform within the movement pushed by tensions within the society as well as the revolutionary impulse itself, right? Like the Arab Spring, new post-Arab Spring regimes, post-Arab Spring governments, these are the post-revolutionary Iranian government had multiple tensions going on. On the one hand, for instance, strong religious politics with certain kinds of aspirations, as Professor Bayat has mentioned, but also pushed by a strong popular uprising for social justice, for democratic participation, for a new sense of citizenship. And I think that that's really key. So what I want to look at here is a little bit, what has that meant in Iran over the last 30 odd years? Again, not as a predictor for other nations have gone through their own upheavals in the last year, but in some of the positive ways. And when my research is on Iranian women, Iranian youth, one of the things I try to emphasize to people when I'm studying or when I'm giving a talk like this is that when we look at Iran, and we look particularly, for instance, at the situation for women in Iran, it's mostly what happens is that everybody looks at the legal situation, and certainly legally after the revolution, Iranian women became second-class citizens. They were restricted in their abilities to hold certain public positions. They're restricted in terms of dress was imposed. I mean, everyone, Muslim, Christian, minority, visitor, any woman who comes to Iran has to wear hijab, proper hijab. It's state mandated. It's not personal preference or not. It's state imposed. Again, restrictions on inheritance rights, on marriage rights, on custody issues, all sorts of legal restrictions were instituted after the revolution that dropped women's legal possibilities within the society. And so I would say, yes, they're legally second-class citizens. But at the same time, and again, in terms of the sort of divisions between a government and certain visions of imposing Islamist Islamic norms, very traditionally conceived. At the same time, there was a post-revolutionary fervor for national unification, for bringing social justice to the population, by the population. So we also see certain kinds of social changes that are tremendously important and are often overlooked. It's the social changes that are often overlooked in Iran in the same way they were overlooked in many of the Arab states that in fact pushed these societies to not only perhaps erupt, but in many of the positive ways, enabled, educated, democratically aspiring societies that then are demanding their participation in their states and in their nations. So what I want to talk today about specifically, and that's what the tables are for, is to this kind of comparison between not so much the legal aspects of, for instance, women's condition in Iran, but the social experience, and in that sense, the legal rights, the lack of legal rights definitely means, as I said, women are second-class citizens, but the social experience actually means if you look at social conditions, the material conditions for women have actually been post-revolutionary, one of more empowerment, which seems like what she's saying, but that's where I find that some of those basic social indicators, which around the world when we're looking at developing societies, are usually the best indicators of women's actual status and relative well-being in society. So legally, you can have great laws that aren't being enforced, or you can have terrible laws that are not being enforced, but you want to look at a couple of key indicators to sort of find out what are things like for women on the ground. And those are usually regarded as fertility rates, and education rates, literacy rates, age of marriage. With literacy rates, and I'll also get into that, not only do you want to see what the literacy rates are nationwide, but you want to see the gender gap between men and women, right? If most people in a society are illiterate, but the numbers are pretty equivalent between men and women, you've got an illiterate society, but it's not about differential gendered power relations. And so that gender gap is also tremendously important, as well as just absolute rates. And the first example which is related to this, to the mean age of first marriage, is one of the legal transformations after the revolution, which is often pointed to and is quite shocking when people first hear it, which is that shortly after the revolution, the legal age of marriage for boys and girls, for youth, was dropped, and as in many societies, it's different for men and women, but it was dropped from late teens to the age of 9. So legally, girls were allowed to get married in Iran at the age of 9. But this is where I like to say, and actually this is one of the first times they've in fact had not have to read out these numbers. So, but if you look at the chart, and the reason that the dates are slightly off is that Iran uses their own calendar. So these numbers are based from the Statistical Center of Iran, but they're really quite reliable, except that they're done for Iranian census years, and then those are, they sort of cross over Western years. So we've got 1966, 67, that's before the revolution, and if you see, and this is broken down between obviously men and women, and then distinctions between urban men and urban and rural. Because again, at this period, before and shortly after the revolution, not only do you have a gender difference in age between men and women, this is the mean age, right? So the sort of middle number between, you've got equivalent numbers above and beyond and below this. But you also have a real difference between urban and rural experiences. So, 25 for men, 18 for women, urban men is 25.6, urban women 19, rural men 24.4, rural women 17.9. So clearly rural young people are getting married much younger than urban young people, but, and again, quite a big age difference. So you've got 7 years age difference really between mean age of marriage between men and women in terms of the age of the couple. And if you look 76, 77, that's the last year before the revolution. In fact, age of marriage has gone down a bit for men, gone up a bit for women. But if you look at, so 86, 97, 86, whoops, that's a misprint. That's supposed to be 86, 87, not 97. Sorry. Oh, okay, caught that. But in fact, so this is now, again, the revolution is 79, so this is a number of years after the revolution, after the age of marriage has been dropped so drastically. Age of marriage has again gone down a bit for men. In fact, it's gone up for women. It's almost the same, 19.7 in 1976 before the revolution, 19.8 in after the revolution. And then it really starts to climb. So in early 90s, it's you get 24.6 for men, 20.9, and similarly across, whoops, I just lost my screen, so I'll read from here. You get the same kind of, you notice you get a closer correlation between age difference between men and women, and also across the urban-rural split. Just press it and it will come back. Yay, thank you. Okay, thanks so much. Okay, great, thank you. And it keeps rising. So we've got it slowly going up for men, but going up much more drastically for women. So by the time we get to 2006, the mean age for first marriage for women is 23, right? So legally, it's 9. But in fact, most women are getting married in their mid-20s. And the other thing that I think is really important at this point to check is that if you look at the mean age for urban women is 23.3, and the mean age for rural women is 23.4. And I've actually double-checked that number, so I missed the typo on the year, but I've double-checked the stats because that's so surprising. In fact, rural women are getting married at a slightly later age, very slightly, but still slightly later age than urban women. And in fact, it's continued to go up. So the latest numbers, which are not here, but are that it's actually slightly above this now, about 24. They've also raised the age of marriage for women, girls. It's hard to know how to use that category there, so it's 12. But this, I think that this is the best indicator right up front of there's a real split between the legal status, the legal rights and the limitations on that, and the social reality. And we see this if we actually look continually at, again, many of these similar social indicators. So the next slide is obviously mean age difference at first marriage, and one of the reasons that I think that's important, and it just helps us focus on that age difference between men and women that we could see in the other slide, but here it's really specified, is that, of course, if you have, and conventionally in most societies, if there's a significant age difference, it's because men are older than women, that husbands tend to be older than wives. But if you have a significant age difference, of course, that really emphasizes the authority within the family. If you've not only gender authority, but age authority, so if those are matched up and husbands are quite a bit older, more experience, more economic experience, often more educational experience than their wives, that also impacts, of course, power differentials within the family. And what we see, not only is the age of marriage rising for women, staying roughly the same for men, but rising for women, but you get a real narrowing of the age difference between the couples, so that by 96, it's 3.2, again, very close. And in fact, also here, that interesting statistic, couples are closer in age for rural couples than they are for urban couples. So you get, what this tells us is that there's more equivalence in terms of power dynamics within the family. And in fact, that's what ethnographic research has shown us, which for various kinds of reasons, in terms of real qualitative, in-depth analysis, women are taking more power. We see this also in terms of national surveys around the country. So again, integration between provinces and metropolitan centers, about attitudes, about authority for mothers and fathers over children, for aspirations for daughters and sons by both mothers and fathers, much more of a sense that by both men and women, that for instance, mothers have authority and should have control over their children, participate in family budget matters, etc. So in fact, what we see is a paralleling of roles, including of age roles. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to mention is the other real key factor, again, for social status is literacy rates. And again, gender difference between literacy rates. So notice this is illiteracy, which is just the way that the numbers have been collected at the point that I got them. So what I want to emphasize with is that despite the reputation, for instance, of the Shah's government as modernizing and westernized and secular, whatever, in fact, the majority of the population was illiterate at the time of the revolution, the majority. And there's a big gap between literacy rates for men and women. So the total illiteracy population rate is 65%, but in fact, it's still the majority of men are illiterate, but it's 54%. So almost half of men can read and write, and the illiteracy rate for women is 77%. Right? That means only about 20% of women can read and write, which is fairly, when I first came across this, I was shocked, I have to admit. Certainly most of the people I'd come across who are Western, middle class, et cetera, yeah, they could read and write, but you realize it was a very, very small, I mean, what that tells you about the society. One of the things that happened right after the revolution is that there was a huge push for elementary and secondary education. Before the revolution, in fact, Iran had some of the best universities in the region and comparable to good universities anywhere in the world. And resources, educational resources really were shifted at the expense, in some ways, for top-rate university education, but to make primary education mandatory, okay, for and free for both boys and girls. One of the ways that they did this is they instituted sex-segregated schools. So girls went to girls' schools, boys went to boys' schools, boys had men teachers, girls had women teachers. And looking at this, you might think, well, that's a problem. Why separate the children after all? But in fact, what this did is, for one thing, it took away the argument that many conservative or religious families had about sending girls to school. Well, they'll mingle with boys and they're male teachers and we don't want that, and they might get corrupted or bothered. If the girls are going to school only with other little girls, only with women teachers, gave women teachers jobs. But there was also a real push to build schools everywhere, right? Including rural communities, small cities, et cetera. Mandatory, free for both boys and girls. And it worked. If you look over, you can see the illiteracy numbers go way down, right? And the gap between men and women keeps narrowing. So 75 is the last year before the revolution. By 1980, they're already starting to go down, and then you see them drop pretty fast. 44, 36, 30, 24. 2008, which is last major numbers we have, it's 15%, 10% illiteracy for men, 19% for women, almost a switch for women. You've got basically 80% literacy now. So that's overall population, from little kids to old ladies, which is why the other thing that we like to look at when we look at literacy statistics and change in terms of policy effectiveness, is youth literacy rates. So this is Iran illiteracy rates ages 15 to 24, and 15 to 24 is the key cohort because that's who's in school, right? By the time you're 15, hopefully if you've been in school, you've learned to read. And that's what the state really has access to. Of course, adult literacy is always an extra project. We know that in the US as well. You've got to do outreach, you've got to reach people who've missed schooling, whatever. And if you look at this, I kid you not, if you go down to the bottom, I mean, you can see how it goes. By now, the youth literacy rate in Iran is essentially full literacy, right? Its illiteracy rate is 1.4, and the difference between men and women is 1.2, 1.5. Right, 0.3%. This is one of the best in the world. I actually cannot find the national literacy rate for the US. I guess I could find it if I really, really dug, but it is not easily accessible, which is quite interesting. Whereas it's much easier to find developing country literacy rates, and by comparison, just to give you an indication of why this is so impressive, if you look at the rates, for instance, for Egypt and Algeria, which are two relatively modern, relatively wealthy Arab states, Muslim states, that have had strong states for quite a while, much more Western friendly. So you would think, all those good things happening for women, much better constitutional regulations and legal rights for women. But in fact, and I don't have this on a slide, but in Egypt, and this is literacy. Egypt in 2006, literacy rate overall for total population for women was 57.8. For women 57.8, for men 74.6. So you've got like 20% difference, and again, not massive, not even close to the Iranian rate overall. And for 15 to 24, again, that key youth cohort, for women it's 81.8, for men 87.9. So much better, but still a 6-point gender gap, and numbers in the 80s rather than high 90s. Similar for Algeria, also 2006. 15 plus, that's the basic total, is for women it's 63.9, for men it's 81.3, and 15 plus, for women it's 89.1, but for men it's 94.4. Again, about a 6-point gap, and in that. So what do we also know about when you have an educated population, and an educated population that includes strong women's education? And yes, I'm leaving out higher education right now, but one of the things that we also know in terms of global statistics is that higher levels of literacy and even just primary education have a direct impact on women's fertility. Not necessarily in the 19th century argument that Western doctors made that if they studied calculus, women would be barren. That we've got that in English, French, and American youth experts writing to parents about why their little girls should not study mathematics. But what we know is that once women have better access to education, they are empowered in the household, they're able to take more control over their own fertility choices and to plan their families, right? Family planning becomes something that's more under women's control as opposed to not. So the last slide I have here is the, whoops, did that come up? Press button on the left. There, population growth rate. And this is actually one of the most remarkable stories worldwide, and it's a slight scandal in population studies of the fact that Iran had the sharpest population rise and then the fastest population drop in history. And so they were remarkably successful at dropping their population rate to a more preferred rate, and yet they have not necessarily been held up particularly as a model because of all the politics around what it meant in good and bad ways to have the Islamic Republic of Iran be a world leader in terms of population and policy planning. Basically, what you see here is that, I mean, if you know anything about population rates, 3, which doesn't seem that much, is huge. It's enormous. It's a very, very, very high rate, and 1.5, 1.6 is relatively, it's Western Europe, it's US, that's what's considered advanced. It even edges at the point at which countries start worrying a little bit about, are we having enough babies? Which is interesting because then you can see that it goes up just a bit at, from 1996 to 2006 from 1.5 to 1.6. Like, it's like, okay, we want a few more kids. So this is the European problem as well. But basically, you've got an underdeveloped population, again, 56, 66, those are 3% before the revolution, illiterate, big gender gap in literacy for women, et cetera. 76, it's come down. The Shah had a population policy planning programs. It starts to come down a bit. It's still very high. It spikes to 3.9, which is one of the highest in the world after the revolution. There's a pro-natalist policy. The universities are closed. There's a civil war. There's also just the sort of thing about, well, people don't really have much else to do, so people are home and they wind up having lots of babies. But remember, just as this is a post-revolutionary government, which is imposing Islamist laws, imposing a vision of Islamic society, but it's also a post-revolutionary government with a strong mandate for social justice and a commitment for mass public education. They're all these kids. And among other things, the government realizes, wow, what are we going to do with them all? And there is a real collective effort that is spearheaded by women's activists, by the medical profession, by population experts, in coordination with the clerical establishment, legal roles, et cetera, to enact family planning regulations. And those are really understood as family planning, means spacing your children or also help planning your children. They institute mandatory sexual education, for instance, for couples to be married. And what you see, and this goes along itself with the continuing improvement in literacy rates, and of course this drops really fast, 3.9, 2.5, 1.5, 1.6, and really levels off. And I'll sort of end there. I mean, okay, so what does that mean when people are having fewer kids? Well, it tends to mean, as it means in many places, that they're doing other things. They had the chance to do other things. They had the chance to focus more on the well-being of those children they have. We see from surveys that men and women are very focused on their sons and daughters, improving their education, improving their possibilities in life. What we saw, what many people saw, even though I think it surprised much of the world with, for instance, the Green Movement in 2009, was you saw this population in the streets, a youthful population, an educated population, a healthy population, a population with democratic aspirations, so that the motto for the Green Movement was, "Where is my vote?" Right? Where is my vote? That's like, you can't get any more democratic than that. You might argue about which one you vote for, but the point is your vote matters. I'll end there. I mean, I think that if we think about Iran, I'm similar to Professor Bayat. My sort of ending note on Iran is always short-term crisis, long-term optimism. Okay, it's not exactly a happy politically right now. It's really Iran is under much more pressure internally than it's been for a long time. Externally, there's all sorts of issues going on, as we all know. But if we look at that long-term sense of optimism, where is the society? What is that society aspiring towards and moving towards? We see actually empowerment in ways that I think all of us would be pleased about, enacted by an initially Islamist and then post-Islamist government in ways that we can hope might be similar in other parts of the region. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. My name is Josh Stacker. I teach at Kent State University, which is that place that Obama was a couple of days ago. And I'm happy to be here with you, even though it means that my colleague Jeannie Sowers can't be, so I'm just pinch hitting. I'd like to make two sort of uneven points. One, I want to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood briefly in Egypt. As many of you know, the new president of Egypt comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. His name is Mohammed Morsi. The second point I want to talk about is sort of the larger process of the uprising or revolution in Egypt. And I'm going to spend more time on that because really what I want to talk about is processes of change and continuity and what we're looking at. So just to kind of bring people up to speed, Mohammed Morsi was elected democratically in June in Egypt. He won 52% of the vote with over 50% of the population turning out. And the reality is he is the president of Egypt. When the anti-Islamic trailer was released and there was the protests that stormed the U.S. Embassy, it was well documented that Morsi was late to respond into assuaging sort of U.S. concerns about protecting diplomatic embassies abroad. He has since repeatedly and often made commitments that this will not happen again. But it was kind of interesting to see kind of how paternalistic the U.S. media and the U.S. policy establishment was, where they were talking to the point that even President Obama made some sort of comment that we're not sure if Egypt is an ally or an enemy at this point. And so what does this mean? We have a Muslim Brotherhood president. Does this mean that the 30 years of relationship that the United States has had with Egypt is over? Does this mean that Mohammed Morsi is going to put all his friends and clients into place in the Egyptian state, and that we're going to be dealing with some sort of anti-American regime? I don't think so, because if you listen to what Mohammed Morsi says, what he's asking for is not so much Islam as much as he's asking for equality of relationships. So he doesn't really care to be an ally or an enemy of the United States. He has said that he'd like to be a friend to the United States, but that this is going to be done in a sort of relationship of equals where there's exchanges, rather than a top-down relationship where the United States can call a dictator and have our national security imperatives ram down a population's throat. So I think that this is a real development for Egypt. And in that sense, I want to speak to the second concern about the brotherhoodization of Egypt. It's not happening, right? The state of play currently in Egypt is that you went from a system that was highly executively centralized under Hosni Mubarak, where he had control over the state apparatus, where he had control over the sort of opposition parties and the political parties, to a state where now everybody is participating in politics and having a say and challenging for state power. So the list of who's participating in this sort of drama is just the ones off the top of my head. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the military, the state apparatus itself, the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, who is distinct now from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, the population, which has sometimes been called the party of the couch, and the protesters themselves. Every time Morsi does something, there are reactions from all these different segments. So what we're finding is that, Morsi's getting a lot of resistance across the board, to the point that he's unable to brotherhoodize the state. And so, given that this is the situation, I think that we should be celebrating the fact that, there is no longer a strong, centralized, authoritarian regime in Cairo, and that we actually have this sort of opportunity to watch a population participate and sort of contest power. But I'm happy to talk about the U.S. relationship, Morsi, the Brotherhood, or anything that you'd like to in the Q&A. The second point that I really want to kind of stress today is really these sort of ideas of continuity and change. If you look at what's gone on in Egypt, the change has been incredible. A population came out and forced a dictator who was on the sort of throne for 30 years to not only leave, but end up in sort of prison. Now, mind you, it's a plush prison, but it's a prison nonetheless, right? You have seen, explosions culturally, politically, socially, where some of the spectacles have become dizzying if you were a long time watcher of Egyptian politics and society. But the thing that gets lost when we focus on all this change is that there's actually a lot of continuities that also exist. So I've come to really kind of believe that what the protest movement, which had three major demands, right? So bread, or economic sort of equality, freedom or political equality, and social justice. So a more sort of equitable system for people to have access to healthcare, education, economic opportunities, right? These demands have largely been unmet. And I think that the real problem is because the Egyptian revolution and uprising hasn't really been about those three issues. It's about maintaining a sort of hierarchy over society, right? So what I'm talking about is that, if you look at sort of the political system, you had a sort of direct hierarchy of how the sort of state officials interacted with sort of the lower members of the state. This system of hierarchy was replicated in family life, right? Where you had basically a very sort of, a strong, male sort of control over the family. This is being challenged. Workplace dynamics, right? People that had been appointed to be bosses and supervisors, maybe in an undemocratic manner, maybe because they were, loyal to the sort of ruling regime. Those are the people that would be sort of overseeing you in the workplace. This hierarchy is being challenged. Culturally, right? The idea that Egypt can ever have a ministry of culture again that even remotely looks functional is almost laughable at this stage, right? There's not going. It's debatable whether the Ministry of Culture ever controlled culture anyway, but now that's just completely out of the realm of possibility. And then lastly, you have this dynamic between really the state versus society, and the hierarchy that basically the state was disciplining the population into sort of political obedience. This hierarchy is being changed. So really what we're looking at, the 18 days of protest that dislodged Mubarak between January 25th and February 11th of 2011, what we saw were these hierarchies across all these sort of places in the high politics, the family politics, the workplace politics, the state society politics, and cultural politics. Basically that hierarchy was shaken, but it wasn't broken, right? And so when you really want to kind of understand what's been taking place in Egypt, since 2011. It's a story that's been taking place a lot longer, and it's basically people that are coming together to challenge this hierarchy and people that are coming together to uphold this hierarchy. It's about who has the authority to kind of manage, change, and direct people's lives. And so I think that we can say at this stage, the people that are committed to upholding the hierarchy and sort of autocratic behavior are more or less, have more or less won, right? So through the electoral politics, through Morsi coming to power, through the sort of parliamentary elections, what we got was actually a replication of people that were all about maintaining a sort of autocratic hierarchy, rather than sort of fully empowering people. Like if I could put this into sort of plain speak, right? There were a bunch of people that were upset with the government and wanted it to change, but then people only wanted it to change as much as it could benefit their inclusion, and they wanted to keep everybody else out so they didn't have to share the spoils. And so this is the hierarchy that we're looking at. And what it's done is it's led to sort of the creation of sort of two separate but sort of parallel tracks in Egyptian society. And as I mentioned, the sort of side that has been mostly winning at this point is the side that has said, you can't have this inclusive change. We're not going to rip down this hierarchy. And so here we go. We're watching a society where there's still continued mobilization. People are protesting everything. No one is sacred or no longer cannot be targeted for ridicule or criticism, right? And again, I think this should be celebrated, right? I can remember a time in Egypt when you couldn't say anything about Mubarak, or you couldn't publish books against Mubarak. Right? So the amount of change that has happened has really been tremendous, but this underlying continuity is rebuilding a tension into the society that's going to lead to more conflict down the road, or more clashes between these two sides than some sort of accommodation. And I think that rather than sort of everybody sort of accepting this sort of newly reconstituted area and slipping back into sort of some sort of quiet existence, that we should celebrate the fact that the protesters really don't care what has happened in Egypt and that they're going to keep challenging this. So I think we should settle in for a very long social process to unfold. And I think that we can expect it to quiet down because, the protesters have used mobilization so much that it's almost borderline discredited the sort of mechanism. But overall, I think that they are now part and parcel of what's unfolding in Egypt. And I think that we can expect another major eruption to come. Maybe not next year or in 5 years, but it's building because the demands of the revolution really haven't been met. And I think that, if we could put this into sort of, some sort of analogous terms, right? So if we think about sort of the civil rights movement in this country, right? Everybody knows that African Americans were given the right to vote in 1965. But the process for them to actually be awarded the right to vote in 1965 started after Reconstruction in the Civil War. And if you go back and you look at sort of the U.S. history, what you see, particularly out of the South, is basically a culture of dissent, right? So you can go look at sort of things from 1912, or you can look at things from 1890, and you can see people saying like, rip down this hierarchy and include us, right? And this led to all sorts of amazing and wonderful things, including jazz music and artistic expressions and things like this. But eventually, right, what ends up happening is the conditions align for this sort of inclusion. And I think that we're really watching sort of this kind of process in Egypt where we're going from only certain people are allowed to participate to really sort of more inclusive, fully open political system. And I don't think that, I'm not even sure I believe in full democracy, right? But, you know, I think that if you are into people having rights, then what's happened in Egypt has been, you know, relatively optimistic at this point, even though for some political scientists, the sort of outcomes don't come fast enough for our models. So, but I'd be happy to talk to you about any of this stuff, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. I know I'm the last speaker, so I'm going to keep mine a little shorter, hopefully. But I did want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm coming all the way from Canada, but I used to teach in Oberlin College, so I'm very excited. Thank someone, yes, shout out to Oberlin, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the main reasons I came, to see some friends in Oberlin, and they paid for my ticket, which is great. I want to talk about Sudan, and Chris Tonsing, our esteemed editor of Middle East Report, always puts me last, and I'm always tokenized as the Sudan expert, which I'm very proud of. But I have worked and talked a great deal about this, you know, Sudan and the two Sudans, and the conflict in Darfur, of course, that's well known, and the very historic secession of the country that happened in the summer of 2011. Partitions and secessions are very rare in modern politics, and the case of the Sudan, of course, is one of the latest, and it has had a great deal of repercussions. The conflict in Darfur continues, the conflict across the borders between North and South continues, and you know, George Clooney's advocacy continues, and all of those kind of things. But recently, in 2011, of course, everyone kept asking me about Sudan's relevance within the context of the Arab Spring. And so I want to touch a little bit upon that, because of course it does border Egypt. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about Sudan in the context of the Arab uprisings, but also maybe conclude with what the secession may mean, the secession of South Sudan, what that may mean for the region. Sudan is important because I'm from Sudan, so that's a very important thing about Sudan. But more importantly, of course, that it has historically bridged the Arab world and Africa. And so any kind of peace in the country, or any kind of instability, rather, in Sudan, whether it's in the north or in the south, affects not only Egypt, and all of what we call the Nile water river basin countries, which are actually 9 countries that share the Nile waters, from Ethiopia all the way down to Rwanda. So although many of us, or I do, of course, speak on the Arab world, Sudan also represents something very important for sub-Saharan Africa. So any kind of instability in that region affects the entire continent, and of course it affects the Arab world. Recently, as you know, Sudan also has international linkages that are very, very important. I mean, it's closely linked to China because of the oil investments, closely linked to India as well. And so that's kind of my justification of Sudan being very important. But what happened this past summer for Sudan was also significant with respect to the Arab Spring, and that is that there were protests that erupted in the city of Khartoum. And what was very significant about those protests was that they did echo the uprisings in Tunisia and in Egypt and elsewhere. The chants were similar. They began with some students, female students in the university, who went on the streets and started protesting. And then it encompassed a whole slew of people, students, the middle class, people who worked in the informal realm. So a whole slew of people in northern Sudan protested, inspired by Tunisia and in Egypt as well. What is interesting also about these protests is that while they did petered out, they really represented something that is very crucial, that's similar to these other Arab countries. And that is, I would argue, the dwindling of authoritarianism, believe it or not. And that is why it's very important to take not only the political lessons from the Arab Spring, but also to understand why we didn't predict it. And I would argue against those who say we didn't see it coming, because professors like Asif Bayat and others have actually helped us to understand that this thing was in fact coming. One of the problems in political science and social sciences has been that in the Arab world, this notion of Arab authoritarianism has been overemphasized. the argument went and continues to go in some quarters is that, Arab countries are immune from democratization for a number of reasons. One of them is that they have very weak civil societies, which are very crucial to, of course, democratization. They have very weak political parties or non-existent political parties, like in Tunisia. And their middle classes, the middle class has always been an engine of democracy. Their middle classes are always dependent financially and politically on the state. These are the three kind of erroneous fallacies that we really have been obsessed with in the Arab world. But people like Professor Bayat and others have focused on a different level of analysis. I mean, they've focused on informal networks and social mobilization at the street level, and they've focused also on grievances, which I think is something that has been really not taken seriously by people who study the Arab world. And what happened in Sudan, I think, also represents that example. There were grievances by the Sudanese population in the north that made them take to the streets. The spark of the protest in this past summer in Sudan had to do with something very concrete, and that it was the imposition of economic reform that basically led to 40% inflation overnight. There was, of course, the secession of the South that made the northern Sudanese government lose 2/3 of its oil income at a time when a country depended on oil for 70% of the national budget. The students, the female students who went to the streets actually went to the streets for a very simple reason, because the bus transportation from their homes to the university went up 55% or 56%, as they put it, even in their chants. These grievances have to be highlighted, and it was what led to the spark. So that kind of understanding of the importance of how grievances are really important in undermining authoritarianism is something to take very, very seriously. But Sudan, although it was inspired, at least the protests were inspired by Tunisia and Egypt, there was something very decidedly Sudanese about them. And that is that, it really led to opposition coming together in a new formation to talk not only about the grievances in the north, but to try to develop a democratic alternative charter, as they put it, for a transition to democracy. To take seriously the grievances of the protesters, but also to take seriously the grievances of those who are dying in Darfur and struggling in Darfur, and others in the northern part of the country, in the eastern part of the country. In other words, these protests really led to a more comprehensive analysis of the problems of the country. So that, having said that, what is the answer to that question that I was posed so frequently after the Arab Spring? Whither Sudan? In other words, will this happen in Sudan as well? And looking at the literature on Arab authoritarianism, we can try to begin to understand whether authoritarianism will in fact erode in Sudan or maybe in other countries. And there are a couple of things to look at. One of them usually is the level of international support. To what extent does the international community support the regime in Sudan, Bashir, for example? That's number one. We know that from other cases. We also know that the fiscal health of the state, that is, the money that the government has, is extremely important. These two features are more important than the issues of a weak civil society and non-existent political parties or weak political parties, because we've seen that has not precluded the kind of revolutions or uprisings, rather, the transitions we see in other countries. But most importantly, and this is the concept that, it's the takeaway concept, so to speak, is the concept of coercion. The level of coercion of the security forces, we know from the cases across the Arab region, is really the most important variable or factor in understanding, whether an authoritarian regime will fall or transition to a democratic stage. But it's not coercion in itself, but rather the relationship between coercion and the strength of civil society. If you take these three factors together, the level of international support, the fiscal health of the state, and whether coercion actually continues to be strong or is weakening. Those are the three things I think that in looking at Sudan, without making predictions, are important in our trying to understand whether authoritarianism will in fact erode. And in the case of Sudan, we know, number one, international support is very low. The US still has economic sanctions against the Bashir regime. You know, in 2010, of course, the ICC actually indicted, Bashir in war crimes. So the international community is very upset at Bashir. That's number one. In terms of fiscal health, the government is going broke because the oil has been shut down. It's going to be restarted, but still it's clear that all of that oil revenue for the Bashir regime has gone. And in terms of coercion, without going to details, what we can track in Sudan and elsewhere is the divisions within the security apparatus. You see basically the Bashir regime and Bashir himself sacking one security officer after another, and there's deep divisions between police forces and the national security forces in terms of how to handle the opposition and the eruption of the protest, in terms of whether they agree with the secession of the South, whether they should actually go into an agreement with the South. So there are divisions within the state security apparatus. The level of international support it continues to be low, thanks to Clooney and others, but much more importantly others, the ICC, for example. And the fiscal health is a problem. Those are indications that are very important for us to keep in mind when we're trying to understand whether the Bashir regime is going to transition to democracy. But Sudan is yet a little bit different, once again, from Egypt, Tunisia, and the Arab countries, in the sense that one has to take into account not only class mobilization and mobilization across social networks, but also ethnic mobilization. Because, our country is distinctly an African country as well, or also an African country. And identity politics around ethnicity and ethnic networks are extremely important. And here is where one has to add a final kind of point of analysis. To what extent will the conflict in Darfur or the conflicts on the borders in the South, to what extent are those going to lead to a recurrence of a great civil war that has really plagued Sudan for the past 4 decades? And here we have to really look at the issue of secession and what happens when countries partition and separate from each other. And to put it very directly or simply, 2 things are very important to keep in mind in measuring whether this country will lapse into another large civil war or not. One of them is whether the 2 countries are ethnically homogeneous. That we know from the literature is very important in predicting whether there'll be peace or war. And another is whether there is agreement on political, territorial, and economic divisions or spoils, so to speak. And unfortunately, in the case of Sudan, and here I'm going to be a little bit less optimistic than my colleagues perhaps on this particular issue, and that is that these 2 countries are not ethnically homogeneous. There are ethnic groups that cross the divides, even within the northern part of the country. And the Darfurians, for example, cross both southern regions and north, as just one example. And even more importantly, perhaps, the oil, unfortunately, is very much at the very borders of these 2 countries, mostly in the south, but really across the border between north and south. And prior to the partition, there has been no, and continues to be no, firm agreement over the demarcation of these borders, number one. And, in a particular part of the country, in the Abyei region, no real understanding or no firm agreement on oil sharing or sharing of the oil revenue. Now, that is very, very important to keep in mind, and I want to conclude with a very, very important, other factor, and that is the external environment. Is Sudan just the problem for Sudanese? And the real issue is, I make light of George Clooney and others, but much more seriously is the role of the United States, of China, of India, and of course the Arab and African countries. This is not an isolated country, obviously. The peace agreement that was brokered partly by the United States was done in haste, and certain agreements that needed to be done, including on oil, including on demarcation. And for those of us who even spoke to the US administration at the time about it, the US administration was adamant, thanks to campaigning, to resolve this issue as quickly as possible without real understanding of the genuine roots of the conflict between the North and the South. And now what we see is that even though the South has partitioned and seceded, these outstanding issues that were not really firmly agreed upon continues to bedevil the country. And we see, of course, the civil conflict continuing across the borders, but also in Darfur. And so the role of the external community, of external actors in this particular case is absolutely crucial. Of course, whether the country will transition to democracy is, like Egypt and Tunisia, going to be really up to the Sudanese people and how persistent their protests are. But in terms of the recurrence of conflict between the North and the South, the US has a great role to play in that, I would argue. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much to all four of our speakers. We have a brief time, I think, for some questions and answers, and maybe we'll go a little bit over the allotted time if there are some questions in the back. Yes?
Hi, I just have one statement. If this whole auditorium were filled with 20-year-old youths, half of them male, half of them female, from the Arab Spring countries, and each of you had to give a couple sentences of advice to the 20-year-old student here of how they can have the society they want 30 years from now when they're 50, what would you say to them? Each of you. I know I'm putting you on the spot, just because we've gone through all this and we've seen, but how can we move forward and help them to have the society they want? What advice would you give them from what we've been through?
Generally speaking, I don't know that I would give any advice. I think that the United States probably does the best when it does the least. I mean, these are really empowering movements, and there's a lot of political learning on the ground. They're going to make, they make mistakes all the time, but I think that over time we can, really trust in the fact that people will come together, learn from their mistakes, and develop a sort of, equally rational and sort of organized population to anything that you could see anywhere else. So I don't know that Western advice or American advice to young people really would have that much of an effect, even if I had something to say.
Anybody else?
Because I'm old enough, I will advise. I think, coming from Iran and living in Egypt, I've also been somewhat interested in the youth issues in these two countries and others. And at some point, for instance, in Egypt, I was very disappointed in the late 1990s with the lack of, or at least I didn't see much of a sort of youth activism at the time, right? I was very disappointed, for instance, when I was comparing it with youth activism in the urban areas in India, this issue of voluntarism and so forth, right? But this really, I think in the year mid-2000 and so, it changed, right? When I was comparing it with the youth activism of the late 1990s in Iran, yeah, I was incredibly enthusiastic about what was happening in Iran and disappointed in Egypt, right? So what I would say to them that, get engaged, be engaged, and organize yourself and push forward the kind of demand and desires that you have, right? And be part of the civil society and do something, right? Don't be blasé. And I think there are now opportunities for them to be, and I think they somewhat proved in the late 2000. And they're very involved, and I think they played a very significant part in this transformation.
This is a little personalized, but I think I would say I would agree with Josh that, because I'm from the region, I would say on a personal note, don't necessarily listen to your elders so much. I think I think what is really interesting is that we do, and I don't want to generalize, but we have had a problem in the past of actually the youth following, the traditions, so to speak, at least in Sudan. Let me just speak about Sudan, and being, followers rather than leaders. And I think what we've found now, and because I know the region well, is that if you talk to the young people, they, as Josh really maybe suggested, is that they actually know a little bit better than us. And I'm very excited about the fact that they're able to wrench themselves away. I'm not talking about Americans here. I don't want to cause a riot, but to loosen and be more independent-minded, and also understand that it's their future more than their parents' future, so to speak. And I think, if I can say that, without, being expelled from the region myself, I think that's important.
Yes, in the back, sir.
I have a question for Dr. Hacker. I was interested in your views about the potential of Morsi becoming a dictator similar to Mubarak, or do you think that it's not going to happen?
I don't know that he can really assert that much authority in a centralized fashion to actually control the sort of state apparatus, the police, the army, or I don't know that he's ever going to be in a position where he can, have so much political capital and so much control over the resources that he can develop a patronage network like Mubarak had. I mean, I think that, Morsi will probably be a one-term president or a two-term president max, would be my guess. Just because I think that the realities of the region just don't allow for someone to stay in power like that. So, I also have the sort of, I met Mohamed Morsi several times over the course of my years in Egypt and doing research and things like that. And, I don't really feel like, I feel like he's very much a consultative person. He relies on a lot of people to kind of get advice. But I'm not too concerned. The organization which he comes from very much is involved in consultation, and they very much believe in institutions. The real problem for the Muslim Brotherhood is any institutional development that they do right now in Egypt. They're pretty much going to dominate the institutions because the other political actors, even though there's a lot of contestation, aren't really up to speed or organized to kind of compete with them. So, what we may be looking at in terms of Egypt is, there's going to be elections all the time, but, the Brotherhood is going to have the ability to kind of win those elections, not based on their performance or how they do in government, but based on their sort of existing networks throughout the country, which no other group besides the state apparatus enjoys. So, I think that Morsi will do things on a daily basis that anger a lot of people. But I don't necessarily think that it's coming from a sort of dictatorial personality, so to speak. I think the structures that he's operating in will probably determine whether he goes more down an autocratic route or more down an democratic route. And in that, I would kind of echo what Khaled said, that there's other factors, international factors are massive here. Whether IMF loans come, how other regional countries interact with Morsi, what the United States thinks and does. And that's why I think that Obama's statement about whether he's an ally or an enemy, I thought was incredibly, unconstructive at this stage. But, so I don't know if I've answered your question directly.
Yes. Actually, maybe what we'll do is we'll take a round of 3 questions, and then we'll have the panelists answer. So I have you, sir, and then you, sir, and then yes.
Yeah, we do appreciate the way things are moving in the Muslim world right now because people are fighting for their democracy. But then one thing that I would maybe ask you if you could have any suggestion. What is it that the rest of the world can do to help? Because at the moment it seems that while those people are trying to fight for their own rights, they also have a problem of identifying who is with them, and that's why maybe I think the problem comes in, that the Western world is sometimes seen as maybe something that maybe is a hindrance to their development, not through what they are doing, or maybe sometimes through what the people perceive them not to be doing. So how can the world help to solve that issue?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I'm curious, I read the statistics on your PowerPoint, and what I'm trying to understand is how that comports to perpetuation or confrontation for the Islamic government of Iran.
Okay. Thank you, Hannah.
I was just wondering if there was a lot to be said about the so-called Muslim failed states, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Somalia, regarding the Arab Spring and so on.
Shall we just go across the table here? Josh, you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll try and tackle the first one a little bit. I mean, so essentially, you know, I think what the world can do, right? So that, you know, this is a very famous quote, you know, if you don't like something, stop participating in it. So, you know, if the world is not interested in authoritarianism in the Arab world, then they need to stop participating in it through technology transfers, through programs like extraordinary rendition, extrajudicial killing, you know, propping up dictators. Because I think that the larger pattern of, you know, political development or some sort of movement towards inclusive democratization or whatever you want to call it. When societies operate with fewer restrictions on their sort of political organizations, they tend to develop very quickly. And when there are political restrictions, they tend to develop pretty slowly. So, you know, I think that if the world was to do anything, it would be to support sort of, you know, full licensing and operations of NGOs and sort of the full licensing of sort of, you know, movements that are pushing for change, rather than sort of participating through things like FDI or aid or, you know, transnational repression. So I think that, you know, they should support political freedoms rather than political restrictions and autocracy.
Yeah, I should probably address, you know, specifically the second question, since that was mostly aimed at me. And I think there's not an absolute, you know, clear, straight line between if you have, again, educated, democratically aspiring population and a dictatorial regime, and how long that dictatorial regime may stay in power. And actually, Khalid talking about Sudan helped emphasize some of those reasons. Iran is, you know, is treated in some ways as a pariah state, but it's got plenty of trade with China, et cetera. It's got oil income. It's got internal coercion, although by comparison to some of what happened in the Arab Spring in Syria and Libya, et cetera, was much less, even in 2009. I think what I was trying to bring out is the extent to which we see within the both possibilities in terms of, for instance, social emancipation for women that can be achieved in part through policies by an officially Islamic state, sometimes in contradiction perhaps even to the government intention. I'm not sure that the government intended to have produced this very highly educated women youth, for instance, but that's what they did. These are public schools. So I was trying to sort of gesture in some ways ahead in a more hopefully optimistic light, despite, again, we look politically in terms of the government, the president, the leader in Iran now, it's quite impressive. That's an understatement. It's not a happy situation, sort of all the way around, internally, externally, et cetera. But I think it's very, very important, especially, for instance, in the U.S., where we don't tend to get a very full picture of what's going on in Iran, to really highlight the extent to which the governing forces in power now are at odds often with other elites and with most of their population.
but that at the same time, if, for instance, in the U.S., that question about how do we support, really want to sort of cheer on the possibilities for, the positive possibilities for democracy, et cetera, in Iran, it's actually probably not by confronting the government head-on, certainly not militarily, which the government just continually uses to crack down even further on dissent, on reform, on population. So it's not so much, I think, that we can count on an immediate uprising. There was an uprising. There was mass popular mobilization in streets for months, and it was a very intense, violent crackdown. And people, the difference in that sense, I think, with Iran and the region is, within living memory, the country, the population has been through a revolution. Now, for young people, they may not remember it, but they know the stories. You can still see the evidence. People know they lost electricity, they lost running water. I mean, they saw what happened in Iraq just over the border recently, and people are not willing to go through that much upheaval, even though they're willing to press hard for change. So I think that's sort of what I have to say.
So I guess what it is, yes, the issue of failed state, I don't really know really much about Somalia. Maybe Father will address that. But what I can say is that in the case, for instance, of Pakistan, I think what the factor that really complicates the situation there is really the presence of foreign intervention. I think that anywhere in the Middle East that you have foreign intervention has distorted internal politics, right? And makes things much more complicated. And by foreign, I mean largely Western intervention. And so in the case of Pakistan, we've been studying, for instance, the transformation of, or the so-called moderation of extremism over there. And there are trends that are emerging there, but you do have also a lot of sort of extremist trends as well. And the reason for that partially is that when the so-called moderate trends want to talk about, bring about issues of democracy, accountability, and so on and so forth, then that they are equated with, the notions of Western liberalism, America, U.S., and then imperialism, and so on and so forth. And that, in a sense, undermines their position. So, it is in this sense that I'm saying that foreign intervention in the presence of foreign interests, Western interests especially, has distorted the internal politics there, and has made it very difficult for those people who seek transformation, and they have put them really in corner.
Well, Professor Bayat answered the question on Somalia also. There is no connection between Somalia and the Arab Spring. Arab Spring, that the Arab identity and what the role that it played is not always emphasized, but there's a reason why you saw a cascade among Arab countries. For Somalia, it's just, Somalis are very clear about not being Arab despite their connections with the Arab world. But more significantly is that it's not about transition, it's about state building. And to answer your question in a more succinct way, I would just echo what Professor Bayat said. All you have to do is look at the contrasting examples of Somaliland in northern Somalia and the chaos that's going on in South Somalia. And the major difference is external intervention. In the north, where I lived and researched, there has been, for the past 2 decades, very minimal intervention by the West because no one really cared about that place. And in the process, state builders and the clans got together and built a stable state. They've had 3 elections and consolidated their democracy. By any definition, that's a consolidated democracy. In Mogadishu, unfortunately, between 2006 and 2008, there was a great example of peace stability. The Union of Islamic Courts, sheikhs and clan leaders, Islamic sheikhs and clan leaders got together and built a state that was stable. Unfortunately for them and for Somalis, it was austere in its social regulations of the population. And that is what happens, as Noah was saying, even with Iran, society and laws can be different. So society was stable, and the laws, for a variety of reasons, followed particular forms of Sharia that were austere, and the United States and Ethiopia decided that it was a threat, and they bombed them. And the result has been a Shabab and militancy and more chaos. This is also, it was at that time, the Union of Islamic Court's leaders had sent one cable after another to the U.S. administration, assuring them that they were not militants and they were going to cooperate with them. That brief honeymoon of stability and peace was destroyed by the Ethiopians and American intervention. And I think, in retrospect, even the American policymakers acknowledge that. And I think it's really important to understand that a state and stability can be built with Islamic norms. And even though they may be illiberal by Western standards, that doesn't mean that they're not good for the people or necessary. And Islam was used in this context as a way to build state institutions. And so this is once again why external intervention is not just a kind of a residual category. What would you call that, Pete? I'm talking too much. I'm being too science. Yeah, in other words, these fragile states are precisely susceptible and vulnerable to external intervention, even more than the stronger states.
Okay, thank you. Are there any last questions before we?
Let me have last question.
Sure, there's one up there as well.
And maybe some other people. My question is for. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, for one thing, we're having a hard time hearing everything that is being said. But is there a commonality, if you please, among Arab countries, or Arab governments especially, but nepotism, where so many of them, even though they're not monarchies a la Saudi Arabia, they're in terms of republics or whatever, and the ones in power, especially the presidents or prime ministers, whatever dictator they have, keep on grooming their own sons to become the leaders of it, a la Assad in Syria or a la Gaddafi in Libya and so forth. Is there a commonality where people tend to accept this nepotism?
My question is for Norma. From the statistics that we saw on screen, it sounds like there is a progress in the women's situation in Iran. I read in some places, I don't know exactly now where I read, but there is encouragement by the Iranian government about mut'a marriage. A mut'a marriage is it abusing women or is it against women? What is your take on that?
Okay, let me take a stab at that. The first question, and others can weigh in too if they like. Yes, in the late 90s and the early part of the last decade, there was a trend in the Arab republics to adopt the hereditary succession practices of the monarchies in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world. And there is a sociologist in Cairo by the name of Saad Ibrahim who got himself thrown in prison in Egypt for coining the term Jumlukiya, which in Arabic is kind of a mashing together of two words which would translate roughly as republico-monarchy. And he coined this term in reference to the succession in Syria when Hafiz al-Assad designated his son Bashar to succeed him, and that just happened as if it was natural. And you're right, there were plans in Egypt to do the same. Hosni Mubarak wanted to turn the presidency over to his son Gamal. In Yemen, Ali Abdel Saleh wanted to turn over the presidency to his son. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi wanted to turn the presidency over to Saif al-Islam. I think we can say that one result of the Arab revolts to date, which appears to be irreversible at this stage, is that that mode of father-son succession in Arab republics is dead. It won't happen. It's not going to happen in Yemen, certainly. It's not going to happen in Libya. It's not going to happen in Egypt. And as we see in Syria, the Assad regime will never constitute itself the way it has been in the past. I'm not predicting its utter fall, but it will never control that country as it has done in the past. So I think that mode of quasi-monarchical rule in Arab republics is probably gone for good. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. I mean, I don't think Arab populations ever really accepted the nepotism. Even in Syria, it was more, you're operating in a context with incredibly repressive, coercive apparatuses. So, I mean, the idea that we generally come down with or that we've seen is that the populations are deeply embarrassed whenever they try one of these hereditary successions. This was refrain over and over and over again in Egypt when they were doing Dolan water. But the fact of the matter is that hereditary successions aren't an Arab problem. They existed in North Korea, they exist in Sub-Saharan Africa, they exist in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is actually the most recent and probably the most prominent of all the hereditary successions. And usually what goes down with a hereditary succession has very little to do with the patrimonial ideas of a father passing down the sort of power or the office to the son. Rather, it is an elite mechanism for regime survival. So what ends up happening is you usually have older elites who they can't come to some sort of agreement about who takes over. So they go and get somebody that can't challenge their established patronage networks, which is usually the young offspring of the son who's not really as well connected as the father was. So it's more about maintaining a regime rather than some sort of deeply traditional sort of vein. And I think that also explains why it goes down in the monarchies. There's a great book by Michael Herb that kind of looked into this that explains that in monarchies. So, but I would agree with Chris completely. The first casualty of the Egyptian uprising was Gamal Mubarak. The second that his protests lasted the first day, Gamal Mubarak's political career was history. And I don't think we're going to be dealing with hereditary succession question in the Arab world anytime soon.
Maybe we can have a further conversation about this. The question was about Mutan marriage, and for those of you who don't know, that's a term for temporary marriage, which is legal marriage, but it has an end point. So and it can be anywhere from a few hours to 99 years. But unlike normal marriage, which is by definition ongoing until death, unless you divorce, but you have to do something to end your marriage, temporary marriage has a limit on it. And the short answer, I would say, is that it's mostly Shia practice. It's not very common in Iran. It's relatively unusual in the last, actually, 2 decades, but at different points, the government has actually very much encouraged it, and that's surprising. They've encouraged it as a way of allowing young people to have sexual relationships that are reputable and Islamic. They don't want young people to have sexual relations or be courting, overly physically involved, overly romantically involved outside of marriage. So this is sort of being offered as a new modern way for young people to mingle, let's put it that way. It's very controversial for all sorts of reasons, and I would say that whether or not it's abusive or not, it all depends, right? Like most things, two consenting adults, I don't know that it's necessarily in some ways there are advantages to temporary marriage. Children are legitimate, there's certain kinds of legal protections for women. On the other hand, it's also been on occasion when the government has proposed it, they've offered sort of houses. I mean, it almost has seemed like state-sanctioned brothels that they're suggesting they put runaway girls into. So, that's terribly abusive. And so in that sense, I think it depends. It depends on the level of control by the partners. Like any sexual or personal relationship, it really depends. And then we can discuss that. Like most things that we talk about, there's certain underlying structures and certain trends, but maybe the best thing to say about that as a last question is that it is a complicated region, and it often is worthwhile delving a little deeper for any kind of issue.
Okay, thank you very much, and I think we've gone considerably over time at this stage, so again, I'd like to thank our hosts here at John Carroll, and thank you all very much for coming. And please, what is your report?